Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation, Rethinking Equity, featuring Celina Caesar-Chavannes. And it is my great pleasure and frankly excitement to have you here. My name is Lolene Birdall. I'm the Executive Director of the Johnson-Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. The Johnson-Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS as we like to call it, is a provincial center for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We are a partnership between the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Regina that is based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, we have swiftly become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. I'm very pleased to serve as today's moderator and to welcome all of you to the first lecture, our inaugural lecture in our new EDI discussion series. This series focuses on engaging current and future public servants on issues pertaining to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the public sector. These are important and timely discussions. Governments in Canada have a pressing need to develop and implement sustainable and forward-thinking strategies and programs that support diversity and inclusivity in their hiring and promotions, to actively combat against discrimination and harassment in the workplace, and to provide employees with a sense of support, respect, and value. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, JSGS's physical homes are in Treaties 4 and 6 territories and the traditional homeland of the Métis. We are glad to welcome all of you joining us today from across Turtle Island, including our speaker who is joining from Whitby, Ontario, which is the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. To help our event run smoothly, we ask that all attendees stay muted and turn off their video during the presentation portion of our event. Please feel free to turn your video back on during the Q&A. And the format of today's event will be as follows. Our speaker is going to present for approximately 40 minutes. Following the presentations, Celina will entertain questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function. Hopefully everyone's familiar with Zoom chat, and send your question directly to me, and I will read your question. You can send this at any time during the talk. You don't have to wait until she's done speaking to send that question to me. If there's any logistical challenges that you're experiencing during the event, please don't hesitate to send a message to Karen. She's over the Zoom chat, or you could just email her at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. And please note as well that as with all of our public lectures, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the JSGS website at a later date. I mention that in part because if you have your video on, you will be shown, but also if you have friends and colleagues who weren't able to make it today, you will be able to encourage them to watch in the future. So all those formalities are out of the way. It's time to get to the excitement. So I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Celina Caesar-Chavannes. And she is a business consultant, a coach, and an international speaker. I've had the pleasure of introducing her before and hearing her speak before. So if I sound excited, it's because I am. She is currently serving as the Senior Advisor, EDI Initiatives, and Adjunct Lecturer at Queen's University. Her book, which I'm sure you've heard of, is called Can You Hear Me Now? It was recently released by Penguin Random House Canada in February. She was a former member of Parliament for Whitby, Parliamentary Secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Parliamentary Secretary for International Development. During her term as a member of Parliament, she was awarded several distinctions, including a feature in the April 2018 edition of O Magazine entitled What Would You Stand Up For? And named Chatelaine Magazine's Woman of the Year in 2019. She has a Bachelor of Science, an MBA in Healthcare Management, and an Executive MBA from the Rotman School of Management. And I'd just like to note, speaking of Celina's book, Can You Hear Me Now? If you don't already have a copy, you will find information in the chat on how to get your hands on a copy. And we are also going to be giving away a copy of her book to one of the lucky guests that showed up today. So if you showed up rather than choosing to watch this as a recording, you do have the opportunity to win a book. So watch in the chat for the link that will allow you to enter for the draw. So this is going to be a very interesting and engaging discussion. I'm going to turn the floor over to Celina. Just a reminder, you can send me your questions in chat at any time. So Celina, over to you.
So thank you, Loreen, sorry, for that very warm introduction. And thank you to the university for having me today, for Karen Jaster LaForge for the invitation and for extending this very warm reception to me today. I'm going to share my screen, but while I'm doing that, I do as well want to acknowledge, because I'm not in Saskatchewan, that I am speaking to you from my home in Whitby, which is the traditional territory, as mentioned, of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, Williams Treaty Territory. And it is critically important for me to do that, especially as we move towards and continue to the fight against oppression and racism, to acknowledge as a settler in this land that I joined forces with our Indigenous brothers and sisters to ensure that we strive towards equity. And as we rethink equity, it's important to acknowledge that that we need to acknowledge the truth about where we are as settlers and the truth of this nation, and a truth about Turtle Island, to be quite honest. And we can't build, we can't reconcile, we can't get to a point of building back better, if I could use that term, if we are not able to talk about the truth. That's the brilliance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It doesn't just say reconciliation, it doesn't just say truth, it says truth, and it should say and then reconciliation. So I would like to acknowledge the struggle that and join forces against racism and oppression with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, but also acknowledge our ancestors, the ancestors, Indigenous and Black, across Turtle Island and those that line the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And so today I want to talk about rethinking equity and our role in correcting it, in correcting some of the shortcomings that exist in equity. We think that we are a very equitable society, or we strive towards equity, but there are challenges with that. And I'm going to go through some of them today. But before I begin, I do want to let people know about, why this is so important to me, and, where my personal philosophies stem from. And it really is around transformative leadership. And the definition given here by Dr. Carolyn Shields talks about transformative leaders having a clear sense of their values and beliefs that undergird or form the foundation of their own identity. They're willing to take stands that require moral courage, to live with tension, and to engage in activism and advocacy. And that doesn't just happen within your organization, within your school, within your institution. It happens in your community. It happens locally. It happens globally. We all have the capacity to be transformative leaders, to really, especially at this point in our history of our world with COVID and conversations about racial inequality, to really take those stands that require moral courage, to have these awkward conversations, and to engage in activism. Because at this point, we know that people are dying because of the disparities that exist in our systems. And so we all have a role to play in making sure that those are corrected. So when we think about equity and inclusion, we talk about the fact that it has so many positives. It has not just positive from an altruistic perspective, but an economic perspective as well. And there's a conversation around, well, prove that it does, prove that it has all of these benefits, prove that it brings people together, prove that, there's a return on investment. How do we substantiate that? And it's important. It's important if we want there to be equity in our systems, in our institutions, in our organizations, then it needs to, like, why are we doing this, right? And for some people, it's because it's the right thing to do. And for others, they require a little bit more motivation. And it might be the monetary aspect. Irrespective, I'm going to share all of them with you today so that we can all be on the same page when it comes to talking about equity and why it's so important to strive towards it. But first, I think we need to understand some definitions, because usually we say diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI as if it's one big long word, and really it is not. So let's start off with diversity, which of course you could read the definition that's here. I got this from the definitions from Queen's University. But we've heard, especially in the last few years, especially when I was in government, that hashtag diversity is our strength. And I never believed that diversity was our strength. I believed diversity was a tool by which we could access our strength. But diversity in and of itself is not a strength. Diversity is ubiquitous. The people sitting on the bench, the 170 plus people that are on this call, if we look across the call, we will see diverse people. We'll see that. And I think what has happened is that diversity has boiled down to somebody in, some upper echelons of an organization saying, oh my God, George Floyd, geez, we need to make this place more diverse. Let's get some more diversity in here. And they pull out a pen and a clipboard and they start, putting little boxes and saying, hey, we need to bring somebody like Celina there, she's Black and she's a woman, check. And we got a 2-for-1. That's awesome. That is not our strength. If everybody on that bench just sat on that bench, didn't talk to each other, didn't have an active, intentional conversations and connections with each other, they would just be individuals sitting on a bench with no capacity to leverage the experience, the expertise that each of those individuals have. So now let's talk about inclusion. Is inclusion one of the strengths that we have? So I think diversity is a tool by which we could start to leverage what is our true strength by starting to have these active, intentional, and ongoing connections that we make because we are diverse. It actually means creating value from distinct experiences and skills that people have. So irrespective of the fact that, I have a certain amount of education and I have a certain amount of work expertise, my ability to navigate systems, to navigate the world as somebody with multiple intersecting identities means that I have reached this bench in the same way as others, but I've had to overcome challenges and obstacles that actually are an asset to organizations if they choose to go beyond diversity to the point where we're talking about or we're being inclusive. So I'm not just there because I have melanin and because I have breasts, but because I actually have the expertise and experiences through navigating systems, through overcoming challenges, through overcoming barriers, plus my education and my work experience to create value for an organization. So that value could only be harvested once we're creating those active, intentional connections. Before I go into any more definitions, I want to make sure that we understand some of some nuances around this. And when we talk about microaggressions, the daily, seemingly innocuous jokes that are directed towards individuals or to the others, saying people's name incorrectly, your name is too long, can I just call you Mary, right? Today I have braids in my hair, a couple of days ago, my hair was short and, people running their fingers through my hair saying, oh my goodness, this looks so pretty. You can't do that. And the usual response is, oh my God, Celina, why are you being so sensitive? I was just joking, get thicker skin. This by the person in the dominant group. This is an assault. And the American Psychological Association in 2018 talked about the fact that microaggressions cause trauma, not pain, not general unwellness, not hurt, but trauma to physical and mental well-beings of individuals. So I want you to think about this as you go along, and think about the fact of transformative leaderships and microaggressions, because it's going to come up again. And there's a lot of conversation about anti-racism, being anti-racist. And if anybody has not read this book yet, I strongly encourage people to do so if they want to be want to have any involvement in this equity work. I find that Ibram X. Kendi gives a really simple definition of anti-racism, and it's the actions that we take to move either towards equity or to further perpetuate inequity. If people could see my hands moving in this case, it's either you bringing equity or further perpetuating inequity. And they stem from our ideas. They stem from racist, sexist, homophobic, ableist, discriminatory ideas that further perpetuate inequity or create equity between different groups. And these are intentional actions that people take, that they could either make a decision to do one or to do the other. So when we talk about equity, what I really want to talk about is, this is where our key strength is. This is where the value lies. And when we think about how organizations, inclusive organizations, are developed, we see these two pictures, and we have been told, equality means treating people equally and ignoring their differences. This is where we say things like, I don't see color. I don't see color is a very racist statement, because saying you don't see color means that you don't see half or an important part of my identity as a cisgendered Black woman that creates the value. You don't see part of me that has created value in me when you say things like, I don't see color, I don't see race. So what we want to strive towards is equitable organizations where we treat people equitably while recognizing their differences. And so in achieving equity is where we start to see that return on investment from that first slide, where we've created those connections, we've brought people together. Remember that prove it slide, where we bring people together, we have better organizations, we have the capacity to bring value to an organization, a higher return on investment. And so when we look at equity, it means that the guarantee of fair treatment, access, and opportunity for all. But we also have to remember that part of the definition of equity is redressing the unbalance. So when we think about things like quotas or affirmative action, or at Queen's right now, we have a program with our medical school where we're allotting a certain number of spots for Black and Indigenous students. At Queen's, we had a ban on Black students in 1918. And so in the redress of inequity, you have to kind of put the balance on the scale. And when you're redressing, you put programs like that in place so that you tip the balances back into place, and then you're able to strive towards equity. But equity is not just something that you address and then move forward. You also have to look back and fix what was wrong before you could go forward. And that is the redress piece. But I want you to think about, in looking at this picture of equity, because this is a Celina presentation, what is wrong with this picture? Just this picture of equity. And I know it doesn't show redress. We're talking about just the picture itself. Let's not think about the redress piece, but what is wrong with this picture? And I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. And this is what we're striving towards, but there's still things that are wrong with this picture. The first being, who was at the table when the decision was made to give someone 3, 2, or 1 boxes? What does your leadership look like? Is it homogeneous? Are we engaging others? Or are we talking to the usual suspects? Are we talking to the same people that we've been talking to over and over again for the past 5, 10 years? And I say to leaders in various organizations that, if we're talking to the same people today that you were talking to 5 years ago, you've done a disservice to the historical events of 2020. We should be having different conversations. You should be having those conversations with people on your teams who are usually quiet, because there's always the one person that raises their hand. They have all the answers. They know everything. They're probably, you want to be able to talk to say, no, let's listen to different perspectives around the table. Every time you walk by that individual that you never engage with, have those conversations. It's no longer about just engaging with those who look like me or are similar to who I am. We cannot create equity in that space. We have to make sure that table is either fully representative, and if it's not, that we're able to engage people, that we're able to bring people to that table, so that what we are creating in terms of trying to advance equity is not based on one homogeneous idea. Pay equity. This is always a good one. Look, ladies, you're going to get equity, but some of you are going to have to wait 40 years. Yeah, if you're a white woman, wait 40 years. You're going to get equity. I'm going to give it to you, just not right now. Black women, look, it's 100 years. What's another 100 years, right? You're going to get equity, but you're not going to get it right now. Indigenous Hispanic women, look, come on, 200 years. You're going to get your box. You just have to wait, right? So why is society so comfortable in sustaining inequity for some? And when we think about the fact that, we're all going to get our box, but we just have to wait a few decades or a couple centuries. That's not equity. That's not fairness. How do our stereotypes and biases play a role? What if there was nothing wrong with this person that had 3 boxes? We've decided to give them 3 boxes based on how our perception, our stereotype, our bias, our racist ideas that we talked about at the beginning. How do they make this person look different, right? So our ideas, things, our racist stereotypes, perceptions say, well, that person needs 3 boxes. They may not need any boxes, but how we perceive them, our ideas about them, make us believe that that's what they need. And this picture here is from the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, where in Toronto, 9% of the population is Black, but 40% of children in children's aids are Black children. And then you may be thinking, well, Celina, it's because they're bad, or their families, they must be terrible. And that is certainly not the case. And I'm sure as you go across the country, you could see this kind of representation for both Black and Indigenous communities. And this is not this is not Celina speaking. This is from the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. The rate at which Black children enter the system is at disproportionately higher rates than their white counterparts. The services that they get while in the system are not the same as the services their white counterparts get. And while white children are exited through family reunification, Black children are exited or aged out of the system, meaning that they have a higher chance of entering the criminal justice system, not finishing high school, having an early pregnancy. And so how does the way we see or service individuals further perpetuate inequity? How does that work? And how do we fix that? When we think about systemic racism, what if there's nothing, again, I'm picking on this guy on the 3 boxes. What if there's nothing wrong with this individual, but the system itself pulls them down and makes them appear smaller? There's no Band-Aid solution that could fix that. And so when we think about systemic racism, COVID-19 is giving us a great example of that right now, where, in April of 2020, we heard that COVID-19 was disproportionately impacting Black communities and racialized communities. And we had leaders of the day saying, well, COVID-19 is not racist. It can't possibly know who to impact. And whereas the disease is not racist, the social determinants of health, where people live, what access they have to treatment, to care, that systemic level, there's racism in that. And so again, while we see that 9% of the city of Toronto is Black, and this data is from the city of Toronto because they decided to collect race-based data, we see that 9% of the city of Toronto is Black. At the highest point, up to 30% of the impact of COVID-19 was disproportionately falling on Black communities, up to 25% of the hospitalizations, and therefore a disproportionate amount of the deaths. 52% of the city of Toronto is racialized, and they're experiencing up to 80% of the impact of COVID-19. These are system level issues that we need to fix in order to address. Housing infrastructure, paid sick leave. These system issues require individuals to be the transformative leaders that are going to advocate, that are going to disrupt, that are going to take stands that require moral courage. Again, is authenticity permitted when we look at this picture and what's wrong with it? Does everybody want or need the fruit? Or is the way we've always done things forcing people to choose an option that's not best for them? When we think about equity, why do we still have gendered washrooms? Why in 2021, after telling people for a year to just wash your hands, do we still have gendered washrooms, right? How does this impact people for bringing their 100% authentic selves to work? And remember that the value that was created by people bringing themselves, like their whole selves, to spaces, by being able to feel included enough in a space to be able to share their expertise and their ideas and their challenges and how they've overcome those barriers. If they are being forced by choosing a gendered washroom, if they don't conform to any of those, they are being forced to leave part of themselves behind. And by leaving part of themselves behind, they leave some of that value behind as well. And resource allocation, there's a lot more things wrong with this picture, but I'll leave it. This will be the last one that I'll show you. Resource allocation. Does equity mean giving the same version of does equity mean giving everyone a different version of the same thing? Or can we reduce expenses by giving people what they need? This person here doesn't necessarily need a box. We could cut that box in half and give 2 people a ramp instead of 1 box. And again, we need to really think about how we can adjust how we behave so that we could have more equitable outcomes. And there was a number of questions in there that I hope that you take back to your teams, back to your leadership of whatever organization that you belong to, and you'll be able to answer some of those yourselves. But really, what I've done here is shown you a number of different problems that exist with a picture, and a picture of equity. So when organizations think that they're equitable, challenging that notion and showing that there are some problems there. And this picture comes from work done by Robert Livingston, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he talks about how to create racial equity in the workplace. And the first part of that is understanding the problem, understanding the root cause of the problem. So again, when we talk about truth and reconciliation, going back a little bit and understanding what some of those truths are that created our present day problems, of racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, discrimination, and how then we start to create that equity in there. Empathy, do I care enough about the problem and the people that it harms? Do I have the empathetic courage to act, to do what is right, to be anti-racist, to be anti-sexist, to be anti-homophobic, to be anti-ableist, to be anti-discriminatory? Do I have the empathy to do that? And then do I know how to correct the problem? And am I willing to do it? Am I going to put a strategy in place to fix this? And am I going to put the resources in place to make sure that it gets done and that it's sustainable? And, this is an important consideration when we think about, oh my God, we have all these problems now. How do we fix it? This is the how. This is the how we get to a better place. But when we think about the resources or the sacrifice, usually when I give this presentation, I'm only part-time at Queen's, so I have this opportunity to give this presentation a number of times. People get stuck on the sacrifice part. I'm making this sacrifice, but Celina, you haven't proved to me that there's a return on investment for equity. And I'm about it. And I'm a really nice person, but I need to see the return on investment. All right, sure, let's do that. So for each of the problems that were presented in those pictures or barriers, there's a cost. And so McKinsey and Company did an analysis of the racial wealth gap and its cost to the United States economy and found that it would cost $1 to $1.5 trillion or 6% of the US GDP by 2028. So if it's going to cost the US just racial inequality, they've done this work in 2015 with gender as well. And everybody's, I'm sure, aware of that study where they said that, if you give women the tools to reach their full potential, it'll add $28 trillion. It will add $28 trillion to the global GDP. So there's a cost for all of these problems that I listed. The real question is, what is the cost to your organization? What is the cost to the people that you serve? What is the cost to our country? What is the Canadian cost? What is the Saskatchewan cost? Right? And I've given this presentation to, the Whitby Fire Services. And, they can't put their cost in dollars and cents. The cost of inequity for an organization like that is destruction of property and loss of life. When we think about how inequity plays a role, how not allowing people to come with their full selves to work by putting barriers in place that don't allow the people sitting on that bench, that diversity bench, to really have those interactive conversations that are required to bring about equity. And so, we could say that we've known this. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a multi-billion-dollar industry that hasn't worked for some people. And that's because, and I didn't say this, I need to put Peter Drucker's name, but Peter Drucker famously said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And if the culture of the organization is such that it is so toxic that you could add diversity to it, you add the little seeds of diversity to a toxic environment, do you think the roots will grow and create those connections, those intentional connections that are required for inclusion? Absolutely not. The culture of the organization has to be one that is inclusive, that fosters inclusion, that helps to create that growth and that equity and that value creation and that return on investment. So we need to create if we want to do any of this, we need to make sure that the culture of the organization is one that breeds that. And how do we do that? That empathy piece right at the middle is critically important. We need to be having these conversations with people. We need to be talking to the unusual suspects. We need to be looking out for each other and understanding those interactions that we are making when we're looking at inclusion and understanding the other's lived experiences. And, when we think about that, when we think about this moment, we think about the fact that, oh, and I didn't talk about the pie. Oh, sorry, I have to go back to the pie. When we think about the fact that when we talk about equity, we usually talk about equity and, people are like, oh my God, if we bring in Celina, she's going to take a slice. She's going to cut into my slice of the pie and I'm going to get a smaller slice. And I like pie, so we're not going to bring in Celina. But I've said that equity creates value. So the way that we need to think about equity is not that if you bring in Celina, or if you have a more inclusive organization, that you are going to have somebody cut into your slice of the pie. What's going to happen is I'm going to add my value to your value. We're going to add it together. We're going to bake a bigger pie so everybody gets a slice and everybody could eat. The challenge right now with equity is that people are so busy holding on to their profit, privilege, and power that they just won't open their hand even a little bit to seize this moment, to bake a bigger pie. And the challenge of that is that 2020 wasn't just a series of historical moments. It was a call to action. It was a call to creating that equity. And we need to see which organizations are going to open up their hands and not only seize this moment, but capitalize on it, because we know that there's a return on investment. And this is what I'm doing with Queens in terms of organizational transformation, but this is what needs to happen with every organization in order for equity to be sustainable. And so this requires everyday actions, and this is a quote from How to Be Anti-Racist, that there's no such thing as a non-racist. It's not, I'm not racist, I have Black friends. Please don't say that. There's no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. Every policy in every institution, in every community, in every nation is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity between groups. And you could replace racial with gender or disability or any form of discrimination. You are either, with every single decision, every single day, further creating inequity or equity. It is really just that simple. These are decisions that we make on a daily basis. And this is about the actions that we are going to take going forward. If 2020 was a call to action, then we need to take action. And let me be very clear that every company is struggling with this. I was reading about TD Bank today that had another report come out by CBC. Every organization in the work that they're doing is struggling with this. So every organization needs to be taking steps forward. Now the $1.5 trillion question is, which one will have the leadership to capitalize on this moment? Which one will have the empathy to truly transform the culture of their organization to highly profitable and equitable ones? And, if I could go back to transformative leadership, it's the ones that have the individuals and the leadership to be transformative, to step in, to take the stands that require moral courage, to live with the tension of going through this painful process of creating equity and changing things, changing how we've done things into something better, taking the time to listen to the unusual suspects. This is what this is what we need right now. We need the transformative leadership to be able to do this, to be able to challenge, to be able to break glass ceilings. And if we break glass ceilings, if we're closest to it, guess what? We're going to get cut, right? To bend the status quo. They're not afraid to get hurt, and they're not afraid to disrupt. And disruption doesn't have to have a negative connotation. Disruption is what drives industry. Disruptors have taken over. Like look at Uber. Uber is a bad example. They've been in a lot of different court cases for some of the stuff that they've done. But when Uber first came on the scene, people were like, oh, they're so small, they're insignificant, we don't need to worry about them. They disrupted the industry, and now they have a place in the market that's pretty substantial. So disruption actually helps create or fuel the change that I think that we need. And if we could combine that disruption with a degree of empathy for each other, I really think that the transformative leadership that we need to create equity in all of our spaces is doable. And so I'll end it with these last couple of slides, and just to say that the world actually really does need us to show up, to be intentional, deliberate, substantive, and to act. We have no more time for this performative nonsense. When we think about, one of my favorite books, Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well, and in it he talks about Dr. Martin Luther King's courageous struggle towards civil rights. And he said that part of that struggle was the need to speak truth, as Dr. King viewed it, truth again, even when that truth alienated rather than unified, upset minds rather than calmed hearts, and subjected the speaker to general censure rather than acclaim. It was better for King to stand on the right side of history alone than to stand with the crowd on the wrong side of history. We have capacity as transformative leaders, all of us, to right a number of different wrongs that are happening, not just in our society, in our community, in our world, but every single day. Every single day. Who steps in when microaggressions happen? Who steps in and says something? Who steps in when they know things are wrong and says, and is actually the ally? Very recently we heard of Joyce and her dying in a Quebec hospital while nurses around her said the most racist things to her. And we think of that as an isolated incident, but how many people saw or heard those nurses say those racist things or microaggressions before that and said nothing? Microaggressions have macro consequences. And so who is going to be the transformative leader that steps in even on those small moments? And who are going to be the ones that step in at this moment when we know people are dying from the disparities caused by COVID-19 and other inequities that exist in our system? And so we all have the capacity to be transformative leader. We have to, we tell our stories, but we also have to be able to have the capacity and the empathy to listen to the ones from others. Living authentically, that's a challenge. But we have to create the organizations that allow everybody to bring all of their experiences to the workplace, to add that value, to be an asset to organizations. As transformative leaders, our leadership does not require a title, and our value has never been determined by a title. The world has changed because ordinary people have done extraordinary things. And I'll end it off by saying, that opening up ourselves to the possibility that the universe has for us is critically important. I wouldn't have gotten into politics if I didn't open myself up to the possibilities the universe had. And I wouldn't be here if I didn't. So I'll leave it there for now, and I will open it up to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Celina, for your presentation and for sharing your insight. We're going to move to the Q&A portion of today's event, everyone. So I had some questions to get us started, but we won't need those at all because we're getting many wonderful questions.
Oh, okay, good.
And so
that's always the scary part. Nobody asks questions, so that's great.
Not a problem with this group.
Okay.
There's a lot of engagement. I'm going to try to group them a little bit so we're not jumping around, and some of them I will will shorten a bit, but I'm going to go to one that I think is kind of the person describes it as being in the tense and uncomfortable category. So
Ooh,
I also know
okay.
you won't shy away from that category.
Yes. I have to
Um,
write things down, so I'm going to just write it down. I have a poor memory, so I'm going to write down the questions if you don't mind.
they say that when it comes to discussions of EDI, that the participation is overwhelmingly female and from non-dominant groups, i.e., a lack of white males born and raised in Canada. It seems as if the dominant group even sees these conversations as the work of women and others, such as immigrants, who are viewed as the ones who should do the labor, while the dominant group gets to do the important work. So how do we move forward with achieving equity without simply creating more work and obligations for those who already have to work harder than the dominant group?
Mm-hmm. And so that's a very important question. And it's one of the reasons why I put up that Robert Livingston's slide. That slide, and I should have said, is for leadership. It's that slide where we talked about the press model, PR, like understanding the problem, the root analysis, the empathy, the strategy, and then the sacrifice. That is for leadership. If leadership wants to have an organization that's going to be sustainable and going to move forward, they need to be at the table. This is not just for, the employee resource groups, or, we have these little groups of like the Black employee resource group or something like that. You cannot do that. This is where leaders have to step up. This is where we decide, or organizations are going to decide, do I want part of that $1.5 trillion benefit or not? So if I'm going to put the resources in, if I'm going to create the strategy and put in the sacrifice, that has to come from leadership. The tone has to be set from the top. And I got to say, like at Queen's right now, we have a new dean, Jane Philpott, and then we have a new principal, Patrick Jean, who has set the tone on what Queen's is going to do going forward. They have taken up this model of understanding the problem, understanding the root, having the conversations. And this is why I said, if you're having the same conversations right now, especially leadership, if you're having the same conversations now that you've been having for the last 5 years, you're doing a disservice not only to the 2020, but to your organization. You will go the way of the dinosaur. And I think this is where we're at now when we're talking about equitable workplaces, when we're talking about or organizations that are going to allow people to bring their true selves to work. And if those individuals are burning out because leadership doesn't have the capacity to lead, those individuals are going to leave and they're going to go somewhere else. And it's one of the reasons why really great people leave mediocre organizations and go to great organizations, because the leadership doesn't have the capacity. So at some point, they're going to have to let go of the power, privilege, and profit and say, let's be a little bit equitable so we can get a piece of that pie.
Thank you. The next question builds from that, so it might have you extend your answer there a bit. The person writes, equity is so important for productive and equal society. In my past experiences, I've observed deep-rooted beliefs that ultimately resulted in unequal treatment. How would you suggest to encourage those individuals who are strong-willed and stuck on the past to start those conversations and to work on their behaviors?
Some people are not going to like my answer to this question, but the train is moving forward and some people need to be left off the train, unfortunately. And they'll miss it. They'll miss the party that we're having, and that's okay. Unfortunately, there is a challenge, and we know even at Queen's that we're going to have resistors who are not going to get on board, and they're going to be at the sides, putting cogs in the wheel and trying to like stop that train from moving, but it's going to go. And again, because the leadership there has already established that the train is moving forward. And the other thing is too, is that It's not up to everybody to do the job of other people. So it's not my job in my role to try to convince someone who is probably in a different role than me that they need to get on board. I've given you the information. I've given you the motivation, even if on a monetary level, but at some point, their equal counterpart needs to do that work. And if they can't do that work of convincing, and especially at this point, post 2020, if somebody still requires the convincing, we're just gonna have to leave without them. And I really do. And it might just seem like this is, oh, Celina, this is an easy, it's a way of skirting the answer. But there really isn't a lot that we could do. There's only so much educating that we could do to people, or we could give to them at this point, right? We've presented the evidence. We know that equity creates value. We know the things that we need to do, and yet we're still not doing it. Even from an economic perspective, we're still not doing it. Why? And I think a lot of people are scared. They don't know where to go. They don't know how to start. And one of the reasons I give this presentation is because there is a way to start. There is a model. Robert Livingston put together a model. Berkeley is putting together questionnaires on cultural transformation. Organizations are presenting this information in ways that organizations could use. So there's no excuse on not moving forward. It needs to happen, because a lot of people are being left behind, and the disparity is further and further. It's growing further and further. And we don't want to continuously have to have great people leave our organizations.
So I'm trying to connect questions as they naturally flow, and I think this one might work a bit. How do we strive to have meaningful diversity inclusion in organizations without people feeling like they are there just to fill a token position?
Right. I've lived this experience. So this is where we get past the checkbox, right? And we know when we're there just for the token experience. It's Black History Month, and all of a sudden they're like rounding up all the Black people to take a picture because they need to have some kind of demonstration that they're doing something. The value can only be extracted and used and leveraged as an asset if you are having these conversations with individuals, if you are leveraging their brains, leveraging the fact that they have a contribution to whatever it is that you're developing, whether it's research, whether it's policy, whether it's a conversation that you're having. It goes beyond their phenotypic appearance. And that's where we need to actually get to move beyond the tokenistic or the diversity hire. The fact that I have 2 MBAs, the fact that I'm strategic, the fact that I've ran national research studies, that's what you want. There's the asset. That is the asset. And the fact that I did that as a Black woman in a very white male dominated space. How did you grow that business successfully in that space? What did you do to do? What are the skills that you needed to have? That's where the asset is. And that's where you create that value. So continuing to use individuals in a very tokenistic way, you will not have the results. That is the $1.5 trillion cost. If you want to reap the benefits from that, then you'll do something different.
Thank you. So we have a lot of people on this call who are either public service employees themselves, either provincial or federal or municipal, or they're students who are are studying and have an interest possibly in working in the public service.
Mhm.
And the next question, actually, I've got a few questions that deal specifically with EDI in the public service. One actually goes, I think, to the heart of a particular question. As a public service employee, how do I advocate for EDI when there's little EDI at the leadership level?
So as a public service employee, see that's the catch to the question, right? Because I don't want to just say, go and kick the door down and just demand it to happen, because people want their paychecks, right? And I think it's baby steps. I think that it is a conversation. And again, I bring up that Robert Livingston piece that was published in the Harvard Business Review, and I'll put the links in here. Having a different conversation about EDI. And this was a very nice article about how to create that in workspaces that could be shared, right? Just shared with your team, shared with your leadership team here. Guys, I think we should read this. This was a great article, and just start with that, and then start with a discussion about how we could make the space more equitable. Now, the challenge with this question is that the job of individuals who are trying to work? Like, they're busy doing their day-to-day work. Do they also have to be responsible for coming up with the resources and tools to now fix a problem where leadership has said that this is part of their vision, that's part of their mission? I find it unfair. But does that need to happen still? Yes. And I'm hoping to the leadership that's probably on the call, or hopefully on the call right now, that this presentation was informative enough to help you realize that we could just start taking baby steps. And that whoever's asking the question, that one conversation that you have with your leadership team that says, hey, listen, look at this article, look at this presentation that we did that says that, this is where we could get that return on investment for being a little bit more equitable. If we could change like just one little thing, the gendered washrooms or the way that we've done things, can we do that? It's baby steps sometimes in this situation, but it also is understanding what motivates them. And that's a lot of work. But what does motivate your leadership? What would make them change how they are behaving? And that's a good question. Why aren't you changing, and what will make you change?
Thank you. I have two questions that are quite similar, so I'm going to put them both together because I think they're interesting to consider as a group.
Okay.
The one is, as a member of a dominant group, what are some of the responsibilities that I have to increase equity? I know we need to communicate with communities, include all voices, and stand up to microaggressions, but are there other responsibilities I need to meet? And then the second one is, as a white man, how do I balance the efforts to uplift marginalized people to leadership, but also leverage my privilege to make change? Is it reasonable to pursue traditional leadership positions to try to influence resistors, those that look like me, to open up to EDI? But am I then taking up space that someone else could better use?
So let me answer the first question. Well, let me go to the second question first, because I think that there was an important point here that that requires some consideration. And whoever asked that question, I think it's really important that they said using their privilege. And I appreciate it, because in order for you to be able to use your privilege for good, you have to acknowledge that you have it. And most people are so offended by the fact that they have privilege, earned or unearned is irrelevant. Just upset that they have that people talk about their privilege, that they can't even use it for good. So I understand the privilege that I have. I'm 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Eastern time. I'm on my computer in my house giving a presentation. Not a lot of people could do that, right? Like we are privileged, and in using your privilege for good, you could only use your privilege for good if you acknowledge it. But the first question around the responsibility, what was it? The responsibility to, can you repeat the first question?
Yes, let me just find it here. Looking at the next one. I know we need to communicate with communities, include all voices, and stand up to microaggressions, but are there other responsibilities I need to meet?
Yes. So number one is the action. So it's the everyday actions that you take in your space to create that equity. And two is the engagement of the unusual suspects, as I talked about in the presentation. But what has happened, I think, post 2020 is people have said that they're woke. All of a sudden everybody's woke, and they're like eager to do something. But there's a lot of us that have been awake for a very long time. And so what do you do when you're awake? You make up your bed, you put on some eggs, you make breakfast, you make lunch, you make dinner. Most of us who have been awake for a long time, we have breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, and some drinks put on the table. And then the people that were woke in 2020, they show up and they're like, oh my God, well, I'm going to help. I'm going to make a latte, and then I'm going to make an omelet, and then I'm going to, no. I already told you that I made breakfast. So either you could donate and help us purchase more coffee, or you could help us make the eggs that we are already making, because we're doing good work making those eggs. Help us do that. Or add resources to get us, a little bit more room at our table. Don't go in centering yourself into these discussions and into this work. There are organizations around you that are already doing some really great stuff. Donate, add your resources, add your privilege and your influence to helping those organizations do really great things. And I think if you have the privilege to do that, you should. And then by demonstrating or acting on that leadership, others will follow, because you have that influence to do that. Whoever you are, whoever has asked the question, you have that influence to do that, and you can.
Thank you. So I have a very personal, not my personal, but a personal question that someone posed. And this question is, how do I talk to my different race husband about the potential racism our mixed race children may face? It's unfair, but it exists. Yeah,
that needs to be a straight conversation, because the challenge is, so when I give this presentation, sometimes I say that even if I'll stand beside another Black woman who is an immigrant, who's 46 years old, who had pretty much the same experiences that I've had, we will have two different sets of thoughts and ideas about the world, let alone someone who's completely different from me, right? What your child, your children are going to face. And even if they never face it, even if they never go through any of the things that you went through or what you anticipate may happen, you at least want to arm them with the skills to be able to navigate that. And that's, I think, the conversation that you have with your partner. I just want to arm them with the skills. You know, in the same way that your kids study algebra and they're like, I'll never use this. I'm just going to give them the tools that they may never, Mom, I'm never going to use this. Just give them the tools. And then if they do need it, or if one day miraculously algebra comes in their life and they're like, oh my God, I'm using it. At least they have the tool in their back pocket to be able to pull it out. If they don't have that tool, you're setting them up for a much bigger challenge. And that's, I don't think you want that, whoever's asking the question.
Thank you. Next question has to do with.
I'm laughing at the chat.
Oh, there's so much going on, and
I'm getting a lot of direct messages.
Oh, okay. And I'll note as well that I haven't been saying it again and again, but pretty much every question starts off with great presentation, loving this presentation, thanks for this presentation. So this next one starts with great presentation. And thank you very much, actually, JSGS community for being so engaged in this discussion. But this one's about microaggressions. And the person writes that they agree we do not say much to microaggressions. And the reason why is that we will looked at as being not nice. People do not receive being called out on microaggressions positively. What are your suggestions to go about this problem?
So who's not being nice? The person who calls it out when it happens to them?
Yeah. If person A says to person B, you know, that's an inappropriate comment. Person B perceives person A as not being nice by. Oh
God. Okay, so I had this conversation last. When I receive microaggressions, let's just be clear. Microaggressions are everyday racism or everyday sexism or everyday discrimination. The micro about it, throw that piece out. That's nonsense. You know, death by 1,000 cuts that causes trauma, or the blunt force trauma of calling me the N-word, both cause trauma. Both of them. Either the death by 1,000 cuts or the blunt force, they both cause trauma. And again, not according to Celina, according to the American Psychological Association. Look up the report. So I don't need to be nice when I'm the recipient of racism or sexism or discrimination. I don't need to respond with kindness. I don't need to respond with the learning moment. I don't. And I'm not even going to say sorry, not sorry. I just don't need to respond with that. You have hurt me, and now you're expecting me to feel sorry for you and to further disenfranchise myself to protect your feelings. And again, so person B could respond the way that they want, but person C, D, E, F, and G, who are in the room sitting around saying nothing, shame on you. Because person D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, who have witnessed this, should be able to stand in. And I mean, it's not for them to like get upset but it's for them to challenge that, to say, no, you are in the wrong here. And you shouldn't be saying that. You shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be acting that way. And it's an awareness piece as well. But it's that everyday discrimination that person B is supposed to have thicker skin and be less sensitive and, you know, just know that it was a joke. No, it wasn't funny to me. And therefore I'm not going to laugh in my response to you. That piece, you know, we don't talk about microaggressions enough. And it's one of the reasons why I spoke about it often in Parliament, because we cannot expect to fix what people are not aware of. We can't fix a problem that nobody talks about, right? And in the same way that, you know, we have a policy, Laline, for if somebody were to touch your leg, you know, just you're sitting down beside them and they just come and they just, you know, rub your leg, you know, just do that. I'm sure if I was doing that to you and be like, and I say, well, just get thicker skin. I'm just touching your leg. Come on. What's the problem? What's the problem, Lillian? I'm just touching your leg. Not a big deal. It's just a leg. Come on. No, but there's a process for dealing with that situation. There's a process for dealing with me, because that's an assault. I can't do that. But for microaggressions, there's just this kind of ambivalence towards it. Like, oh, we don't have to deal with it. Yes, we have to deal with it, but we need to talk about it. We need to define it. We need to speak about it in the way that it is. And it is everyday racism. It is everyday sexism or homophobia or whatever. It's everyday discrimination. There's nothing micro about microaggressions.
Still recovering from you
touching your leg. I apologize. I apologize. You're the only one on screen. I had to use somebody else. I didn't want to say Doug. I mean, I don't even know who Doug is. He's right. I just see his name.
So I have a definitional question that came up here about microaggressions, and that is, are complimentary remarks on someone's abilities based on generalizations of race or gender considered microaggressions?
Like, you're pretty for a Black girl, or you're so articulate, as if you didn't expect me to be. This is where it gets kind of, and this is where the challenge is around microaggressions, is that, and that's why I don't call them microaggressions. I call it everyday racism. And when we think back to the definitions given by Ibram X. Kendi, if you are asking that question from a position of, she can't possibly belong here, or I didn't expect that Black people were so smart, or man, for a Black girl, she's cute. No, sorry, not that's, you don't do that. Please just leave that alone, right? So you know internally whether what you are saying is going to be offensive. And it's one of the reasons why people with intersecting identities often don't have these mishaps, because we have to think through with ourselves so many scenarios that could go wrong with what we say, or things that we've actually been recipients of, that we formulate our sentences so precise as to not offend. And our lived experiences have given us the tools to do that. Your awareness now has to give you the tools to do better. So, and this is one of the reasons why I do not teach or train or be part of any training that deals with unconscious bias. It's BS. How long does your consciousness, does your bias remain unconscious before it's just willful ignorance? Like, we keep doing this unconscious bias. You're enabling people to continue to behave badly. Stop it. Let's get to a point where now you've awakened your biases. They are now conscious. Now you're aware of them. Now you need to do something about them. You are now aware. You're now woke. You're now conscious. Let's move on. And you now have the authority to do something differently because you're aware. I'm being very blunt with you, Lillian, right now, but we got to get through this program.
Well, the next question can build from that one. Celina, can you please speak more about the underlying root causes of systemic racism?
Ooh, somebody wants me to fix the world today. So let me talk about it from a democratic perspective, okay? So because everything that exists, all the systems tie in from our democracy. So our health system, our education system, our immigration, justice, etc. And people may not like this answer, and that's too bad. But our democratic institutions were built on a principle of exclusion. So women, racialized people, indigenous people, we didn't have the right to vote. We weren't there, right? It was exclusively white men. And then that status quo was reinforced by policy, Indian Act, residential schools, anti-Black immigration policy. Every racialized group had some kind of discriminatory policy within our Canadian government, reinforced that status quo of exclusion. And so now we get to our present day model. And even in the 42nd Parliament from 2015 to 2019, there wasn't a dress code for women because women weren't supposed to show up, right? So I'd show up to Parliament in my jeans and t-shirt because we didn't have a dress code. And I was okay with that. It was a protest for me. But when we think about systemic racism, we think about the underlying structures from way back then that prevented people from actually having equal access to opportunity within our systems, right? When we talk about the definition of equity, of not having that ability to be a part of the system. So now the system has been reinforced by and maintained by a particular homogeneous identity, and the world has changed. And so that system now doesn't function to benefit us or to benefit Indigenous people or to benefit people with multiple intersecting identities. It doesn't. And so when we think about our prison system, the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in our prison system, look at the Globe and Mail report, Bias Behind Bars. Look at you'll see that it is racism that exists within the system that causes that. And when you build a system on exclusion, you have to then dismantle it and build it back up so that it is an inclusive structure. And how do you do that? That takes a lot of work. And if we're not willing to do the work, we'll never get to the point where we have truly inclusive and equitable spaces. And this is not just based on race. This is gender. This is ability. This is any form of discrimination that exists has to be dismantled.
So we have time for one more question, but I'm actually going to put two questions together because they're of a similar theme. The first question is, with a lack of a paradigm shift or a lack of transformative leaders, how would you recommend organizations take direct action, such as instituting quotas, preferential recruitment, and educational support of marginalized group? The second one is, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. What do you think is the best strategy for ensuring more diversity and inclusion, especially in leadership positions in the private sector? Do you think the quota system should be enforced in the private sector?
This is an excellent question. And I'm going to start by saying that I hate quotas, but they're necessary. So when I talked about equity and the redress, so inequity does this where one group is superior over another, so that it's not balanced, right? This is supposed to be a scale, it's supposed to be balanced. It's my arm, but imagine it as a scale. So it's like one group is superior to the other. In order to create that balance, you have to redress. So that means you may have to put in quotas, affirmative action, those kinds of systems to create that balance. That is a short-term measure. And this is just my belief. People may believe that it needs to be long-term. This is just my belief, that it is a short-term measure to redress an inequity that has existed within a system, whatever system it is, private or public, right? So funding to the Black community by government organizations, or the hiring of a certain number of women or racialized or disabled or persons of different gender, right? So you have those quotas, whatever that is a short-term measure. The problem is that people usually stop with that. And they forget, or they maybe are not even aware that that is a redress of the inequity that existed. that is not creating the equity that needs to go forward. So if you have redressed, so you address the problem is that we have to have more DEI. We're going to redress it based on quotas or affirmative action. But going forward, we're going to put in the press model that I showed from Robert Livingston. We're going to put it in our strategy. We're going to have a strategic framework that now addresses the culture of our organization that has to ensure that there's equity. And we're not just going to do that. We're going to put in the resources, the other S, the sacrifice, to ensure that it is sustainable. So quotas, affirmative action is a short-term measure to redress. Then you still have to move forward and create the equity in the organization and put the resources in to make it sustainable. And that's on leadership to do that.
Well, wonderful, Celina. That's a fantastic question to end on, I think. And I'd like to thank you for your insights today, for your frankness, for your leadership on how we should be rethinking equity, and also for the energy and enthusiasm that you bring to this. I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but Celina is making it a mission to really bring these topics to the forefront in Canada. Your speaking and public engagement has been beyond impressive, Celina, and you're really we're very grateful to have you here. It's been truly a pleasure. I'd also like to thank our audience members, not only for joining us, but for all the comments in the chat. It sounds like some of you are messaging Celina.
Yeah, and I can't even follow all of the direct ones. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to like do two things at once, and I can't. Sorry.
The engagement has been
awesome.
Wonderful. I apologize I wasn't able to get all of the questions. There's a number, more than a number. Well, anything's a number, but there was a large number I wasn't able to get to. And I thank you for asking these questions and really thinking about these topics.
Yeah. Now, can I just say to the person that puts the race as a social construct, yes, and that needs to be unpacked. There's no name, it's just UCAS Saskatchewan. Yes, and we should start there. But I don't do anti-Black racism training. That's not what I do. So I understand that we need to start with those kinds of conversations, and it's very powerful to understand where race has come from. But if I can invite people to just order the book, because Ibram X. Kendi talks about race as a social construct, how it perpetuated slavery, where it came from in the 1700s. In here, do it. If you want to do this work, if you want to be an ally, if you want to even start to transform your space, get the truth, understand the truth first. Thank you.
And speaking of books, Celina also has a book. And if you don't already have a copy, be sure to take a few minutes and enter the draw that Karen's been putting the link into. And if you enjoyed this lecture, and based on the reactions that I'm seeing in the chat, the answer to that is yes. Please keep an eye on the JSGS events calendar, because as we mentioned, this was the inaugural lecture of our EDI discussion series. So there will be more events coming up, but I could not think of a better way to have us get this started. So what I'd like to ask everybody to do just before we let Celina go is to maybe turn on your video, unmute yourself, and in a count of 3, I'll give you a second just to unmute yourself. If we could give her a true round of applause, and thank you for attending today.
Thank you for your comments. These comments have me dying. The direct messages. I'm not going to call out anybody's names, but you guys are really funny. Thank you very much.
Well, you need
Thank you
to come
very
to
much.
Saskatchewan when it's open. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, audience. This has been a true delight, and I'm going to let you guys go a few minutes early, so you have the gift of a few minutes before you click into your next Zoom. So hopefully that's exciting for everyone as well. Be sure to enter the draw. Be sure to come to our upcoming talks. Thank you so much, Celina. Thank you so much, everyone. Special thank you to Karen, who organized all of this. The amount of work she does for us is amazing. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. We'll turn off the recording. Let anybody who wasn't here today know that they need to watch this video. And with that, bye for now, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.